It feels like it has been forever since we have seen a new actor get cast in the beloved role of 007, James Bond.
The name's Bond. James Bond.
Folks, I am not too young to remember the hype behind the casting of my personal James Bond, which is Pierce Brosnan, nor am I delusional enough to say that James Bond himself, Daniel Craig, is one of the better castings we've ever had for the role. But in today's episode, we are going to be dialing the clocks back to the very beginning of James Bond in cinema and talking about every single actor through every single era of 007 that almost got picked for this part. Some of them are going to be obvious, like when Henry Cavill went out for the role, and some of them, I promise you, will surprise you. So let's pass it over to Chris and talk about every actor that almost played James Bond.
Bond. James Bond.
One could write a whole book on the men who would be 007. And here at JoBlo, I've worked on dozens of videos covering every facet of the super spy's history. But strangely enough, I never actually took a deep dive into the actors who very nearly played Bond, James Bond. Truth be told, there are dozens ranging from global superstars to people whose popularity briefly peaked to complete unknowns. But it really needs to be divided up into eras, as there were 8 specific periods where Eon was actively looking for a new 007, with us arguably in the 9th such period now with Amazon and Denis Villeneuve trying to find the man who will lead James Bond into the next stage of his cinematic screen history. So, let's take a look at each era. Now, pre-Dr. No is the first one. Before Sean Connery was cast as James Bond, producers Albert R. Broccoli and Harry Saltzman cast a pretty wide net for who was going to be the first person to play James Bond in a movie. Of course, Barry Nelson had played an Americanized James Bond on the TV version of Casino Royale. That doesn't really count.
You're an ugly little man. Why don't you stop talking?
A lot of people say that Cary Grant, James Mason, and David Niven, who later on would actually play a kind of version of James Bond in the spoof movie Casino Royale, were strong contenders, but that's not really accurate. You see, the first James Bond film was a glorified B-movie with a modest $1.1 million budget. They were never going to cast a big star, and instead, the role really only came down to a few actors who weren't that well known at the time. One of them was Roger Moore, who had a brief, pretty unsuccessful career in Hollywood as an MGM contract player, and briefly replaced James Garner as the lead on the TV Western Maverick.
Hang on, James.
The thought had occurred to me.
The other was Patrick McGowan, who declined the role because he was Catholic and didn't approve of James Bond being a womanizer. He'd play a much more chaste, small-screen spy in the really good series Secret Agent, or alternately known as Danger Man, before creating one of the greatest TV shows of all time, The Prisoner, and going on to a long, distinguished career, which included a bad guy role in Braveheart pretty late in his run. Another actor who was pretty closely associated with the role was Richard Johnson, who was catching on in North America at the time, having starred in Robert Wise's The Haunting. He would play a very James Bond-like character in the Bulldog Drummond revival films Deadlier Than Male and Some Girls Do. How close any of these men actually came to playing the role is debatable, though.
That's a time clock, you know.
As it seems, the only one who ever really got major consideration was Sean Connery. Second period was around the time they made On Her Majesty's Secret Service.
My name's Bond. James Bond.
The downside of hiring an unknown to play James Bond was that they signed this actor, in this case Connery, to a whole slew of films, and even after he became a household name, Eon refused to make Connery an equal partner in the series, and he felt he was getting the shaft financially.
I think they were on their way to a funeral.
Thus, he refused to re-up after You Only Live Twice, and the search for 007 was on. This time, Eon was clear. They wanted a complete unknown, someone they could mold. No major stars would be chosen, and they would hold cattle call auditions where actors would try out for the role. One of these was actually covered by Life magazine, with the eventual winner, George Lazenby, an unknown Australian model, actually being part of the story. None of the other actors profiled, save for John Richardson, who had been the lead in some Hammer movies like She and 1 Million Years BC, were known at all, and a lot of them would sink back into obscurity. The next big period was around the time they made Diamonds Are Forever. You see, the public did not accept George Lazenby in the role. Even still, the movie actually did okay at the box office, as one was one of the higher grossing movies of the year, and Eon was willing to have Lazenby continue in the role. They figured he'd grow into it. But Alas, Lazenby really accepted some very bad business advice. He figured the whole series was old-fashioned and that he was the next Clint Eastwood, so he quit. He promptly sunk back into obscurity, although his brief run as 007 has made him a much-loved cult figure many years later. This time, Eon actually decided to make James Bond American and to shoot a much lower-budget James Bond movie in the States. Albert R. Broccoli actually wanted Burt Reynolds for the role, but he said no, with him very smartly telling them that making Bond American would be a mistake. Another guy who came very close to nabbing the part was TV's Batman, Adam West, who would become great friends with the Broccoli family. The actor they actually hired to play the role was John Gavin, who had co-starred in Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. The contracts were signed, but then United Artists, the American distributor, told Eon they were making a huge mistake and that they needed to do whatever they could do to get Connery back, and if they did, they'd greenlight a massive budget. As such, United Artists ended up giving Connery an unheard of $1 million salary, as much as it cost to produce Dr. No, and a 2-movie deal. Connery accepted and actually gave all the money to charity, but also swore it would be a one-off. So once he was done with the movie, Broccoli and Saltzman would be back at square one.
You're joking.
I never joke about my work, 007.
Phase 4 was around the time of Live and Let Die. You see, now that Connery was out of the picture, Eon opted not to go ahead with the decision to make James Bond a Yankee, as Diamonds Are Forever had proved to be a major hit. They briefly considered 2 British actors, Michael Gambon, who would later become a huge English character actor, playing Dumbledore in many Harry Potter movies, and Timothy Dalton.
I got the message.
Gambon actually told Eon that he was too ugly and out of shape for the role, while Dalton, who was only in his mid-20s, thought he was far too young. Instead, they approached Roger Moore, who was actually 3 years older than Connery, and had actually been under consideration twice before, both pre-Dr. No and around the time of On Her Majesty's Secret Service, when they almost shot The Man with the Golden Gun in Cambodia, only for the Vietnam War to make that a pretty insane idea. So Live and Let Die was a big hit, as were most of Moore's other James Bond movies. But he wasn't always going to play James Bond, and despite having the longest run of any 007 actor, he almost was replaced 2 times in the series.
What are you doing?
Just being disarming, darling.
The first was before For Your Eyes Only, when salary negotiations simply broke down. Roger Moore, by this point, had become a huge star. His James Bond movies were making a lot of money, and, well, he wanted a raise. And Eon were notoriously stingy.
There's never a cab when you want one.
Enter an actor named Michael Billington, who had appeared in The Spy Who Loved Me and came very close to playing the role, with production stills even taken of him and released to the press. It was all a ploy, though, with them just playing chicken with Roger Moore, who eventually came back for what was supposed to be his last James Bond movie. Then, in 1982, pre-Octopussy, 2 other actors were considered, with Billington considered a backup, as was Quebecois actor Daniel Pilon. First, there was Lewis Collins, who was the star of The Professionals, a hit TV series who many at the time pegged as a potentially amazing 007. Yet, despite being a household name in the UK, apparently his meeting with Broccoli didn't go well at all, and he was taken out of consideration. Oddly, the actor who came the closest was the American James Brolin. That's right, father of Josh Brolin, who filmed elaborate screen tests for Octopussy that are pretty easy to find online, with Brolin, who took his near brush with the role in stride, actually doing some commentary and interviews.
But I think my mouth is too big.
It's just the right size.
Brolin was actually pretty well known at the time, and it has to be said, he really did kind of nail the part, with him adopting a mid-Atlantic accent that's not quite American, not quite British, but would have worked. The only reason he didn't play the role was because Eon wasn't able to shut down a rival James Bond movie, Never Say Never Again, which was going to happen with Sean Connery. So they figured they needed Roger Moore on the part. And sure enough, Octopussy, with Moore as James Bond, actually outgrossed Never Say Never Again. Moore had such a good time making Octopussy that he happily signed on for one more movie, A View to a Kill. But in hindsight, he realized this was a mistake, as he was by now too old for the role. Brolin's screen test, though, I have to say, for Octopussy, is a really good one. So the next period, Phase 6, when they decided to get a new Bond, was around the time they made Living Daylights. In 1986, the most exhaustive, high-profile search for a new 007 was launched. Many actors screen tested for this role, including Sam Neill, who, like Brolin, allowed his screen test to be added to the Living Daylights DVD.
So you're Tatiana Romanova.
My friends call me Tanya.
Interestingly, despite being pretty good casting, Neil kind of botched the audition, with him coming across as too stiff and serious and not charming enough in the role. He himself wrote in his biography that he thought he would have been a lousy James Bond.
After careful consideration, I've decided not to endorse your part.
One actor who nailed his audition was Pierce Brosnan, who was actually hired. But NBC, who had cancelled Remington Steele, but still had Brosnan under contract, pulled a fast one and greenlit another season, thinking that it would be a real coup to have the new 007 Pierce Brosnan still playing the role.
You must be Remington Steele.
Yes, I really believe I am.
Alas, Broccoli would have none of it, and Brosnan, devastatingly for him, lost the role. Adding insult to injury, NBC actually cancelled the last season of Remington Steele after just 6 episodes, although of course it had a very happy ending for Brosnan. Another pretty serious contender was Lambert Wilson, who of course was a French actor and who memorably played the Merovingian in the Matrix film series. While he was French, Wilson had actually lived for a time in the UK and probably could have actually adopted the accent had he been given enough time to prepare, but alas, they decided not to go ahead with him. Another actor that almost played the role was a guy named Anthony Hamilton, who had played a spy on the TV series Cover Up and eventually would go on to lead a short-lived revival of Mission Impossible. You know why he lost the role? Because he was gay, and at the time, well, it was a different era, and really that in the tabloids could kill a career, with many actors forced to stay in the closet. And sadly, it seems as though Hamilton lost his brush with James Bond because of his sexuality, and in fact, sadly, would die of AIDS about 7 years after his near brush with 007. In the end, Timothy Dalton was hired and went on to a short but very solid run as 007. So the next phase, 7, was in 1994. Pierce Brosnan, of course, was always the popular favorite to finally nab the role that was almost his in '86, but he wasn't the only actor that was considered. The studio wanted Mel Gibson, who actually told me, myself actually, of a few encounters he had with 007 when I interviewed him over the phone a few years ago. Ralph Fiennes would later play M was also a possibility, but one of the closest candidates was actually a handsome young British actor named Mark Frankel, who had had an art house hit with the movie Leon the Pig Farmer. Sadly, he would die young in a car accident in 1996 after having achieved some cult stardom as the star of a US vampire show called Kindred the Embrace, and probably would have had a really good career. The final phase, Phase 8, took place between 2003 and 2005. When Pierce Brosnan was dismissed from the role following Die Another Day, Eon decided to make 007 a whole lot younger, with them opting to tell an origin story. Many actors were considered for the role, including the late Julian McMahon, and one that came very close to nabbing it was Goran Vishnik, who of course was on ER at the time, but apparently simply could not master the English accent. Funny enough, both future stars of The Boys were under consideration, Karl Urban and Anthony Starr. Can you imagine? Homelander as 007? His screen test actually leaked online.
Because we share the same passions. 3 anyway.
As did the screen test for Rupert Friend, Sam Worthington before Avatar, and a young man named Henry Cavill, who, it has to be said, really nailed his audition and looked the part despite his long hair, only for his very young age, he was 22 at the time, to be the thing that got him disqualified at the 11th hour, when the 35-year-old Daniel Craig was given the part. And that, my friends, is the short history of all the men who would play James Bond. Watching the auditions that leaked online are especially fascinating, as you can kind of critique the performances, with it seeming, for my money, like Brolin and Cavill were the only two that tested really well and could have nailed the role in their respective eras. But what do you think? Let us know in the comments. And who do you think should be the next James Bond? Who knows? Maybe Henry Cavill will pull a Pierce Brosnan and eventually get the role that was very nearly his in 2006, although given his age, seems very unlikely. My hunch is that the next James Bond probably going to be in his early 30s, which is usually the age they go for.
I'm sorry. That last hand, you killed me.
Thank you for clicking on our video, everybody. If you like what you saw here, please make sure you like the video and subscribe and share with your friends who like this sort of content. JoBlo was created by movie fans for movie fans, and we appreciate your support.